Hi everyone, I'm Vitaly. So let me open the first section. The first speaker for today, it's my pleasure to give a floor to Professor Franz Berto from the University of St. Andrews. The title of the talk is Imaging and Imagination. Please, you're welcome.
Hello, can you hear me, folks?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Good. I have a little bit of echo, but if you can hear me fine on that side, that's okay. Good. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's good to be here. Oh, there. Let me see if I can share my slides. Do you see the slides, folks? I think you do. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's see if I can also move them. Yeah, they work. Good. So, if you can hear me fine, I'll get started. So, I'm going to talk about imagination, and I want to talk about the logic of imagination, and also the epistemology, or if you like, the epistemic value of imagination. And I will focus on a kind of imagination which is often called counterfactual imagination. And that's for the imagining bit in the title. As for the other bit, imaging, that will need a little bit of introduction, but we're going to get to that later. Okay, so the initial point, I think, when we wonder about the logic and epistemology of imagination is that one could wonder, what is the point of that? So you could say, what was the point for our ancestors who were busy with very real world concrete problems, okay, like feeding, mating, chasing prey, escaping predators, and so on? What was the point of having a faculty of the mind that allows one to escape from reality and to contemplate unreal imagined scenarios? Now, one answer that is sometimes given is that imagination helps with planning. That is to say, it helps you to think of how to achieve a goal or avoid the feared outcome by answering what if questions, so hypothetical questions. Okay, this is going to be one of our guidelines while we explore the logic and epistemology of imagination in this talk. Another guideline we will see is that the idea that if there is a logic in imagination and fictional thought, it must be a logic that piggybacks on the logic of belief revision. Because I will propose to you that imagination works as a kind of simulated belief revision. Okay, so that's going to be our guiding thought. So here's an example of how you use imagination to answer what if questions. So suppose that you are one of our ancestors and you are chasing a prey, and the prey is on the other side of a small stream. Should you jump the stream to try to reach the prey? Okay, it may be dangerous to recklessly try. So what do? Well, you imagine jumping. Okay, and so what you're doing is you're addressing a hypothetical question of the kind, well, if I jump the stream, if I were to make the jump, would I make it to the other side? Okay, so that's the scenario you contemplate in your imagination. Now, what kind of imagination is going on here? Imagining is highly ambiguous. We use it to speak about entertaining ideas, daydreaming, hallucinating, free mental wandering, lots of different things. The kind that I want to focus on, I'm going to label as reality-oriented mental simulation. Okay, why I talk about reality-oriented and why I talk about simulation, we're going to see very soon. So I want to start by addressing, in the light of this kind of imagination, a puzzle, an epistemic puzzle. It has been called the puzzle of imaginative use. And in a nutshell, it asks, well, imagination seems to be arbitrary escape from reality. So how can it give us knowledge of reality? Okay. And the people who ask this question are Amy Kind, whom you can see in that picture, and Peter Kung. I couldn't find the photo of Peter on the internet, so you just get a picture of Amy. And you also get the cover of a very good edited collection on the epistemic value of imagination, edited by Amy and Peter. And if you look at the the answers given by people in that collection to the puzzle of imaginative views. So how can we gain knowledge by imagination? The short answer is something like that. Imagination as reality-oriented mental simulation is constrained. It deviates from reality, but in a regimented way, hence the reality orientation. But how does such a regimentation works? Okay, that's where formal epistemology, logic, epistemic logic, and we will see also probability logic can help to provide an answer. So go back to our ancestor who is chasing a prey and imagining whether he should jump the stream. So what if you jump the stream? You don't imagine, of course, that you'd suddenly grow wings and fly to the other side. Of course, you can imagine that if you like, but that will spoil the point of the exercise, right? In this kind of mental simulation, you keep things realistic, importing beliefs on your actual physical abilities, for instance. So what you're doing in such an exercise is you're following some minimal alteration principle. You keep reality more or less as it is, or as you know or believe it to be, compatibly with what's needed for the initial supposition to hold. Now, what you're doing in this case is, and that's the link to belief that I want to propose, simulating and revising your beliefs. Okay? And this goes along well with a certain view of imagination, which has been pushed by a number of people like Greg Curry, Ravenscroft, Goldman, and others, which is a simulationist view. And the general simulationist view says that imagination essentially recreates non-imaginative mental states. In perceptual imagination, you simulate perception. In propositional imagination, which is the one that we're going to focus on, so imagining that P or P is a proposition, many people think you simulate belief. For example, Margherita Arcangeli has written a whole book on the connections between imagination, supposition, and belief. Another connection that I'm going to put on the table before we start making things formal is the link to conditionals, because there's a mythical footnote due to Frank Ramsey, which links our assessment of conditional to hypothetical thinking, imagination, and belief revision in the light of a suppositional input. And in that famous footnote, Ramsey says, quoting him, if two people are arguing if P will Q and are both in doubt as to P, they're adding P hypothetically to their stock of knowledge and arguing on that basis about Q. So that in a sense, if P Q and if P not Q are contradictories, we can say that they're fixing their degrees of belief in Q given P. Now, this procedure is what we nowadays call, after him, the Ramsey test. And the Ramsey test, is a procedure to assess conditionals. But the important thing is that it makes of our suppositional assessment of conditional a kind of simulated belief revision. We assess conditionals taking into account our background beliefs. So the test makes of supposing A the analog of learning that A. And so it makes of our assessment of B under the supposition A the analog of assessing B in the light of our revision of our beliefs upon learning that A. Okay? And the two procedures are similar. So for instance, this is a very famous Paul, famous philosopher, famous photograph of him, Paul Feyerabend, in the kitchen. Okay? So supposing or imagining in your head that Paul is in the kitchen and wondering whether or how likely it is that it's dinner time on the supposition is very similar to seeing and so learning that Paul is in the kitchen and adjusting our belief or degree of belief that it's dinner time accordingly. So beliefs come into flavors. Okay, beliefs or credences can be all or nothing or graded. So the Ramsey test actually splits into two kinds of tests, a qualitative and a quantitative version. So if we use that style for a conditional expression, a qualitative Ramsey test is going to be A conditional B is acceptable, all or nothing, just in case B is acceptable in the same sense on the supposition of A. And the quantitative Ramsey test is going to say, well, the degree of acceptability of A conditional B is going to be the degree of acceptability of B on the supposition A. Leave aside for now what kind of conditional is that. We're going to focus on this in a minute. Next, in the formal epistemic logic, probability logic literature on belief revision, everybody agrees that revision of beliefs upon learning something new should be minimal. That is to say, you should change your beliefs or credences as little as possible upon learning that A. Correspondingly, per Ramsey test, you should assess A conditional B by assessing B against the system of beliefs that's changed in your mental simulation, in your imagination, as little as possible to accommodate the the supposition A. But now, there are two very different ways of supposing or imagining things when we assess conditionals, and so there must be two different kinds of simulated belief revision procedures going on. And that goes back to a distinction which is very famous, the distinction between indicative and counterfactual conditionals. Okay, that's the famous example you find in my slides due to David Lewis, who credits Adams. The first one is an indicative conditional. It says, if Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, then someone else did. The second one is a counterfactual conditional. It says, if Oswald had not killed Kennedy, then someone else would have. Now, the first conditional, the indicative Oswald, sounds very acceptable. Okay, that means by the Ramsey test that when you imagine that the antecedent is true, so that Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, the consequent someone else did sounds very acceptable in your imagination. Okay, but the second conditional, the counterfactual, doesn't sound very acceptable, at least if you believe in the results of the Warren Commission, that Oswald acted alone. And when you imagine in the second way, okay, when you assess the counterfactual, what if Oswald had not killed Kennedy? Then you may not accept that someone else would have killed him. You may imagine that in a counterfactual situation where Oswald doesn't kill Kennedy, well, no one else does. And Kennedy just dies an old man. But it's the same antecedent and the same consequent in the two conditionals. They only differ in the modes. So there must be different ways of imagining the antecedent of a conditional, and so different ways of minimally revising one's beliefs under supposition. Let's call them indicative and subjunctive or counterfactual supposition. And it's the latter kind of imagination of supposition that I want to focus on, the counterfactual one, because it's less well known and less explored than the one in the indicative mode. Now, let me single out 4 general features of the kind of supposition that goes on in imagination as mental simulation. These features, there's 3 of them, hold both for indicative and for counterfactual supposition, and they should all hold when we consider all or nothing beliefs, and also when we consider degrees of belief or credences. The first one is called certainty, and it says, when you suppose or imagine A, you take as true A within your supposition. The second one, minimality, says, well, if you already take A as true, you will not revise your beliefs when you imagine that A. The third one, consistency or consistency in comparison, as it's sometimes called, it says, if B is taken as true under the supposition A, and A is taken as true under the supposition B, then when you revise your belief by A and when you revise them by B, you must get to the same results. These features are around in the literature. You find them in Lewis's works, James Joyce, and others. Certainty looks fairly obvious. I'm not going to get into this unless you have questions in the Q&A. Minimality says that revision must be conservative. David Lewis says no revision when none is needed. For instance, if I tell you, or imagine that Rome is the capital of Italy, and you already fully believe, you're certain that Rome is the capital of Italy, you're going to say, okay, well, there's not a lot of imaginative work for me to do, meaning there's not a lot of belief revision for me to carry out on the imaginative input, because I already fully believe that. And the third one, consistency, says, quoting Lewis again, that the method must be consistent in its comparisons, because if it failed, revising by A would be both more and less of a revision than revising by B. And that doesn't sound very rational. Good. So when we want to have a formal account of how imagination as simulated belief revision works, we want to have something that somehow satisfies these constraints, these 3 general features. Now, I want to focus, I told you, on counterfactual imagination. And first I'll do with a qualitative case. And the qualitative case can be modeled, so we're dealing with all or nothing full beliefs, fairly simply in doxastic epistemic logic, piggybacking on results by Grane that go back to the 90s. And what Grane did in the paper that I'm going to use is he basically used epistemic model logic to recapture a formal theory of belief revision called KGM. Now, some of you, if you work on belief revision, will be familiar with AGM belief revision theory, the Alcoron, Gardenfors, and Mackinson theory. Now, many people say that that matches to indicative supposition or indicative imagination, whereas a number of people, including me, think that KGM from Katsuno, Mendelssohn, and Grane is an alternative axiomatic theory of belief revision that's sometimes called belief update, okay? And that matches to indicative suppositional imagination. And it works differently from AGM. So I didn't present KGM in the axiomatic presentation because I think if you're familiar with model epistemic logic, the kind of model recapture proposed by Gran is going to be more familiar to you. So here's how it works. Take a simple propositional language with the usual truth functions, a conditional connective, it will be a counterfactual, we will see, and a belief update operator. Let the finite belief state of an agent be given by a finite set of formulas. If B is their conjunction, that notation you find in the slides should be read as expressing the result of updating by a belief set represented by B. Next, semantics. It's a possible world model. It's got a the usual non-empty set of possible worlds. It's got a function in it which maps each possible world and sentence A of the formal language to a set of worlds. And then there's a truth set assignment. It assigns to each formula A truth set, that is to say, the set of possible worlds in which the formula is going to be true. Now, that function is set up to work like the set selection function, which may be familiar to you from the standard Lewis-Tanaka treatment of subjunctive or counterfactual conditional. So it's a function that takes as input a possible world and the formula A and spits out intuitively the set of worlds where A is true and which are the closest or most similar to W. Okay. And you may know how the counterfactual works in the Starnaker-Lewis setting, right? If kangaroos had no tails, they would topple over, the Lewisian example. Well, look at the closest or most similar worlds where the antecedent is true, that is to say where kangaroos have no tails. If the consequent is true at all of them, then accept the counterfactual, right? Good. Now, famously, that set selection function satisfies these three conditions. You find them in textbook of conditional logic. You find them in Lewis. Condition 1 says a set of selected worlds where A is true is going to be, well, a set of worlds where A is true. Second one, condition 2 says if W is already an A world, that is to say it's a world in which A is true, then the set selection function is going to spit that world only and nothing else. That's going to be the single closest world to itself. And C3, the third condition says, well, if the closest A worlds make true B, and vice versa, the closest B worlds make true A, then the two set selection functions will spit out the same set. They will coincide. Now, try and give an imaginative or suppositional reading to these conditions. You will find that when you read them suppositionally, so you see the set selection function as giving you the worlds our cognitive agent looks at when supposing or imagining A from the viewpoint of W, well, these map exactly to the three conditions that I gave you before: certainty, minimality, and consistency. C1 says, well, when you suppose A, you're only going to look at worlds where A is true, and that makes a lot of sense, because that's the scenario you contemplate. So when our hunter imagines that he jumps on the other side of the stream, well, he only looks at situations where he jumps on the other side of the stream. C2 says when A is already true at W, the singlest closest A world is W, so you move nowhere in your epistemic space. And the third condition says, well, if the closest A worlds make B true and vice versa, then you look at the same worlds when you suppose A and when you suppose B. Now, the truth conditions are constraints on the acceptable set, truth set assignments for the acceptable models. For the counterfactual, the truth conditions say, well, it's just a Lewis-Stalnaker style counterfactual. It's going to be true at the world just when the consequent is true at the closest antecedent worlds. So all standard here. But now we also have the update operator. And the truth conditions are the ones that you see in this slide. So basically, you update by A your belief set B by looking at the closest A worlds from the standpoint of your belief state. So you work through each one of these worlds, and for each one of them, you move to the closest world to that one where A is true. Okay. Now, this will generally comprise a plurality of worlds because in general, you're not maximally opinionated about which world you're in. That is to say, you're not perfectly certain about everything. So there's a plurality of worlds which are epistemically possible for you. So you implement the minimal change to make A true by switching for each one of your belief worlds, each one of the worlds which are consistent with your beliefs, to its closest A world, and then you lump them all together. You do the union. Now, why is this a nice framework? Because it has explanatory value. It explains how counterfactual imagination works and how it differs from imagination in the indicative mood. When we suppose A indicatively, so for instance, we imagine that Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, what we simulate is getting new information about the actual world. So we just take all of our belief worlds, which represent how we believe the actual world to be, we just intersect them with the A world, and we kick out the rest. We believe the actual world to be such that Kennedy was killed, and we retain that under the indicative supposition that Oswald didn't kill Kennedy. But that's not how we work when we imagine counterfactually. When we imagine or suppose A counterfactually, we depart from how we believe actuality to be so that we can make relevant comparisons with it from within the supposition. So we take the worlds where A holds closest to each one of our belief worlds, and we lump those together. We look at the scenario closest to how we believe actuality to be, except that Oswald didn't kill Kennedy. If our beliefs are warranted enough, the worlds closest to our belief worlds where Oswald didn't kill Kennedy maybe all include worlds with no killing. Good. Now, in this setting, logical truth and logical consequence are respectively just truth and truth preservation at all worlds of all models. So that's just the standard definition of logical truth and consequence in modal logic. And the logic that's sound and complete with respect to the class of such models is just Lewis's counterfactual logic from Lewis's famous book, Counterfactuals, the VCU version. But in addition, now we have the belief update operator. And so we want to investigate the interaction between that and a counterfactual. And guess what? That's governed by a twofold inference principle called Ramsey's rules, because it recaptures the Ramsey test that I told you about before. It fixes how the counterfactual interacts with the update operator. So the Ramsey rules basically say that the counterfactual, if it were that A, it would be that C, follows from or is accepted in belief state B, if and only if C, the consequent, follows from or is accepted in the update of belief state B by A. So the idea is you counterfactually imagine that A, you update your beliefs in the light of that. If you end up accepting C in the supposition, then you're going to accept the counterfactual. If it were that A, then it would be that C. That's just the Ramsey test for the counterfactual. So good result. Good. Now let's look at the quantitative case. So now we're talking about not how you simulate a revision of all your all or nothing beliefs. We're talking about how you simulate a revision of your credences or degrees of belief on a counterfactual supposition. And the standard way to model credences or degrees of belief is by using probabilities. Now, the probabilistic phrasing of our three general features of supposition goes thus. So, the first principle you see in the slide says, well, the probability, and take probability as expressing your subjective degree of confidence, your degree of belief, okay? So the probability of A on A is gonna be 1. So notice I'm saying on, I'm not saying conditional. So don't read that notation as conditionalization, right? I'm not saying the probability of A conditional on itself is 1. I'm just saying the probability of A on A is 1. And that's because the kind of probability revision mechanism I'm going to introduce in a minute is not conditionalization. Conditionalization is good for indicative supposition. It doesn't work for counterfactual supposition, which works differently. But first, let's see the three principles. So the probability, so the subjective degree of confidence in A on A is going to be 1. Second principle says that if your subjective degree of belief or probability for A is 1, then the probability of anything on A is going to be the probability of that thing. It's not going to change. Okay. And the third one says if your probability of B on A is 1 and your probability of A on B is 1, then your probability of anything on A is going to be the same as your probability of anything on B. Now, P1 again maps to certainty, the first of our three conditions on suppositional thought. The probability of anything on A must assign to A probability 1. P2 maps to minimality because it says, well, if you're already certain of A, so you assign probability 1, you're not going to change your distribution of probability on the supposition of A. And P3 maps to consistency in comparison, because it says if you're certain of B on the supposition A, and vice versa, you're certain of A on the supposition B, then the probability of anything on A and the probability of anything on B is going to be the same. Now, these three features are satisfied by conditionalization, but they are also satisfied by a different method to revise probabilities. And that method that I'm going to introduce in a minute fails this principle that you see on the slide, which is instead satisfied by conditionalization. So this principle is sometimes called in Bayesianism preservation of certainties, because it says if your subjective probability for B is 1, so you are certain of B, and you're not certain that A is false, so your probability for A is above 0, then your probability of B conditional on A is still going to be 1. So that means you retain certainties. So when you are certain that B is true and you conditionalize on A, you will still be certain that A is true. Now, why is this good for conditionalization? Because it explains our judgment on indicative Oswald conditional. Because remember, we are certain of B in this case, in the case of the example, that Kennedy has been killed. We retain that certainty under the indicative supposition of A. So when we indicatively imagine or suppose that Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, because we are certain that Kennedy has been killed, we'll retain that certainty and we conclude, well, then it must have been somebody else. This is why the indicative Oswald conditional sounds very acceptable per the Ramsey test. But now I told you that, and we have seen that indicative supposition is different from counterfactual supposition. So if indicative supposition in the quantitative case is governed by conditionalization, what is counterfactual supposition governed by? Well, David Lewis, in a famous 1976 paper called Probabilities of Conditionals and Conditional Probabilities, introduced a probability revision procedure called imaging. That's the one that makes for the other part of the title of this talk. That's why it's called imaging and imagining. Now, imaging, I claim, models how we update probabilities in abductive, causal, and explanatory thinking, and it governs counterfactual imagination in the quantitative case. Here's how it works. Take again a finite set of possible worlds, and again, it has the total closeness ordering. So every world has the totality of the other worlds arranged by similarity around it, as in the usual Lewis-Stalnaker conditional logic. Assume that for each world, the formula A, there is a single closest world. This is sometimes called Stalnaker's assumption because it was accepted by Stalnaker. And also Lewis adopts it, even if you may know Lewis criticizes the assumption in the book Counterfactuals, but when he introduces imaging, he adopts the Stalnaker assumption. Good. Now, given a probability distribution P or of a set of worlds, so the probability distribution is going to assign a probability to each world that represents your degree of credence, your degree of belief that that's the actual world. And of course, the probabilities assigned to the various worlds must add up to 1. Then you can define the image of a certain probability distribution under A as per the following formula. The probability of a certain world W1 on the image of A is going to be the sum across the various W's such that W1 is the closest A world to those other worlds. So technically, the probability of each world in imaging is moved, it's switched to the closest worlds where A is to. Because that closest A world may be the closest to more than one world, you need to do the summation and add up the probabilities of all of those worlds. So each world where A is true when you do imaging on A will keep the probability it had before, and it may gain probabilities moved from worlds where A is false. So because probabilities are only moved around in imaging, they're not created or destroyed, the image of a probability function is itself a probability function. Now, here's a simple case that explains to you the difference between conditionalization, which is more familiar from the Bayesian literature, and imaging. Suppose that we have 3 possible worlds. So it's a little model, W1 and W2, and they are equiprobable. So they are equally likely for you. Okay, so the probability of each one is 1/3 because probabilities must always add up to 1. In addition, world W1 and world W2 make A true, whereas world W doesn't. And the ordering, the similarity ordering, has it that world W1 is closer or more similar to W than world W2. So that's the little drawing you find at the bottom of the slide. You got the three worlds, W, W1, and W2. W1 makes through not A, W makes through not A, W1 makes through A, W2 makes through A, and the similarity is as you see it, W1 is closer to W than W2, and they're all equally likely, 1/3 probability each. Now, what do you do when you revise your probabilities by conditionalizing on A? Well, first you kick out W, you kick out the worlds where A is false, and then you have the probability mass of that world, and you must give it to the other worlds because the probabilities must always add up to 1, and you just renormalize. So conditionalizing on A, the probability of W1 is the probability of W2, and it's just a half. Now you don't even use the similarity ordering when you conditionalize, and normally people don't speak about worlds being ordered by similarity when they introduce conditionalization. But imaging exploits the ordering. When you update by imaging, the first step is the same as when you conditionalize. So you kick out all the worlds where A is false, but then you switch all of the probability mass in your hand to the closest A world, to W1. So whereas when you update it by conditionalization, the posterior probabilities were W1 1/2, W2 1/2. When you update by imaging, the posterior probabilities are, well, W1, which is the closest, gets all the probability bonus. So its probability is 2/3 after imaging, whereas the probability of W2 stays at 1/3. So this is a simple example is illustrating how imaging is a different way to update probability from conditionalizations. You then define, as usual, the probability of the sentence as the sum of the probabilities of the worlds where it's true. So that's the notation you find there. Now, if you look at that notation with the summation, it may be familiar to some with respect to something I mentioned before, the qualitative case. Remember the belief update operator we had in the modal qualitative setting. Okay, go back to that and plug in uniqueness. So start assuming again that there is a single and closest antecedent world for each world and formula in your language. You see that it's the same structure. Okay, both of those formulas say that when we suppose or imagine A counterfactually, we take each world in B, in the truth set of B, and perform a minimal change. In the qualitative setting, we switch from W to WA, the situation we imagine on the counterfactual supposition of A. In the quantitative setting, we switch the probability of W to WA. If W was already a world where A is true, these are null actions, so nothing changes. Next, in the qualitative case, we lump all of those A worlds together. In the quantitative case, we add up their probabilities. So this gives evidence that KGM in the Grane model recapture and imaging are the qualitative and quantitative ways of phrasing the same process, counterfactual supposition. Imaging satisfies all of those three principles for probabilities that I mentioned before, P1, P2, and P3, so it complies with the three general features of suppositional thinking. But unlike conditionalization, imaging favors preservation of certainties. It's easy to show that this is the case. So it could be that a previously certain B becomes uncertain for one who supposes A counterfactually, wondering what is the case under supposition. That did not happen with conditionalization because conditionalization preserves certainties. Now, why is this a good feature of imaging? Because imaging explains our judgment on counterfactual Oswald. One who wonders what would have been likely if Oswald had not been killed, if Oswald had not killed Kennedy, may relinquish one's certainty that Kennedy was killed and find non-killing worlds more likely. Next, Lewis in that paper even came up with a Ramsey test for counterfactuals. So he proved that the probability of the Stalnaker counterfactual, if it were that A, it would be that B. Okay, so that's the counterfactual with the Stalnakerian assumption. There's always going to be a single closest antecedent word. E is the probability of the consequent B on the image of the antecedent. Okay, the Stalnaker counterfactual is toward the world W, just in case the consequent is toward the single closest antecedent world. So the truth set is exactly the set of worlds W such that their closest antecedent world WA makes true B. the probability of this set is exactly the probability of B under the image of A. So the Ramsey test holds in general for all probability distributions and possible A with no result, no triviality result. I mentioned triviality result because if you know about probabilities and conditionals, you may know that that paper is famous because Lewis proves a famous triviality result showing that the probability of an indicative conditional cannot in general be equal to the probability of the consequent conditional on the antecedent. What is less known is that in the same paper, he proved that there is no triviality for counterfactuals when the counterfactual is the Stalnaker one, and when that's mapped to imaging. So we do have a Ramsey test for counterfactuals here. Good. Now, all of this was about giving the idea that imagination, that counterfactual imagination works as a kind of simulated belief revision. Back to the epistemic value of imagination. Now I'm going to talk about accuracy. Sorry. So you may have heard about accuracy first epistemology. This is the view that accuracy, that is to say closeness to the truth, is the fundamental epistemic value of credences. What is it that makes your degrees of belief epistemically valuable? Well, that they are as close to the truth as it gets given your evidence, right? Now, how and in what sense is imagination as reality-oriented mental simulation, and in particular counterfactual imagination, accurate? So now we are investigating its epistemic value. When in an exercise of counterfactual imagination, we assess some B not plainly but hypothetically, that is to say, under the counterfactual supposition of A. Remember our hunter. Okay? The hunter imagines that he jumps the stream, and he assesses how likely he finds the idea that he will make it to the other side, supposing or imagining that he jumps, right? But such an assessment can be more or less accurate, just as the plain assessment of B can be. In counterfactual imagination, we represent things not as they actually are, but as they would be if the imagined input was true. But then our aim is to get accurate beliefs on what is the case. So we look through the hypothetical scenario and back into the real world where our interests lie. And that's why it's so important that we have Ramsey tests for counterfactual conditionals, matching them to counterfactual imagination. Because to the extent that our credence that we get to the other side of the stream under the counterfactual supposition that we jump is accurate, our credence in the counterfactual that if we jump the stream, we would get to the other side is accurate about the actual world. So the Ramsey tests allow the accuracy test to bounce back from the counterfactual imagined world to the actual world. So to the extent, similarly, that our credence that nobody else would have killed Kennedy under the counterfactual supposition that Oswald had not killed him is accurate, our credence in the counterfactual that is, oh, if Oswald had not killed Kennedy, then nobody else would have, is accurate about the actual world. Okay, and this is how, by piggybacking on the idea of accuracy first epistemology, we can vindicate the epistemic value of counterfactual imagination by thinking about it as a kind of simulated belief revision. Good. That's what I had to say. Thanks very much for listening. And I guess I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's time for questions. Okay, Evgeny, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. And I have a small technical question concerning Granny's logic. In Granny's semantics, we have a function mapping possible wells and formulae to propositions, sets of possible wells. And the second argument of this function is a sentence or a formula. And it's well known that we have also, we might have also propositions as the second argument. of such a function in a conditional logic. And the question is whether or not it's essential
Good.
for Granny's logic that we have sentence, not propositions here.
Yeah, good. That's a very good question. So I just replicated the Grana presentation, and he uses formulas, but because he has a total ordering of worlds, the two turn out to be equivalent. So he could as well have said, oh, take as input a world and a set of worlds, so a proposition in that sense. It would have worked the same way because you can prove that when in your models, there's a total ordering, meaning each world has all the other worlds totally ordered around it. It doesn't make any difference. There is a difference when between using formulas as inputs and using the corresponding truth sets of worlds, when you don't have a total ordering, which you can do in weaker logics. But the difference is washed out in this kind of setting. Yeah, I think it's more elegant to just use sets of worlds because then you're not like throwing syntax and talk of formulas into the semantics. But in this case, it doesn't make any real difference. And an interesting point in connection to this is that now I'm going back to my slides. Is that if you drop the total closeness ordering, and so it's not anymore equivalent that you use formulas and that you use propositions or sets of worlds. The third condition that you see, condition 3, may fail. So if you want it to hold, you have to add it manually. Whereas when you have a total ordering of worlds, which makes the difference between formula and truth set vanish, that condition C3 is automatically satisfied. So if you buy my argument that that captures a conditional suppositional thinking, then you should have that condition. And so that gives you further motivation for having a total ordering of possible worlds.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Запрос лучше сюда. Садитесь, я стол. Нет, прям просто
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about the borders of imagination.
Yeah.
Consider the situation that I think about the possibility when I became totally crazy. I know that this possibility is probable because all of us haven't guaranteed to be in clear minds, but I can't imagine what happens in this if this possibility become true, because epistemically, in this case, I will not identical with actual myself in the sense of my thinking, my behavior, and other mental specification. And I cannot imagine what is more probable and what is less probable concerning me in this case. And so it is problematic for me to revise my probability function under such a supposition. Can your logic, your semantics describe such a situation?
Good. That's a good question. So, do you think so? Do you want to make a difference between two preliminary questions just to see if I got it right? First one is, do you want to make a distinction between imagine that you are crazy and imagine that you believe you're crazy?
Yeah.
And it's the former you have in mind, not the latter. Because they're very different things. So, for instance, if I imagine that I'm Napoleon, I think I can do that. Okay, and then I'm going to imagine that I'm an emperor, I'm very powerful, I'm on a white horse, whatever. Okay, but if I imagine that I believe I'm Napoleon, then I'm going to imagine completely different things. Because then now I imagine that I'm crazy. I'm a deluded person who believes that he is Napoleon. So which one did you have in mind? Imagine that you are crazy, or imagine that you believe you're crazy?
I have in mind that I try to imagine that I'm crazy, and I believe that it is probable that I can become crazy, but I can't imagine this situation in details.
Okay, so
Because
do you think that that has got to do with the first person? So it's difficult for you to imagine yourself crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's not difficult to imagine anybody crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, then this seems to have to do with psychological limitations about what we can imagine about ourselves. Now, this is a very messy subject, and you may wonder, oh, to what extent you want a formal logical model to be able to represent the psychological limitations of people? And I'm not saying it shouldn't, but the other way around. I'm one of those who are sympathetic to the idea that sometimes you want to have tweaked, logical, formal, probabilistic models which represent like less idealized agents or agents who are incapable of imagining certain things. Now, the framework as it is now, as I presented it to you, is rather standard. It's just epistemic logic or a kind of non-standard way to revise probabilities imaging. But one way would be to use literature from awareness logic. I don't know if you ever heard of awareness logic. So in awareness logic, it's a kind of epistemic logic where you make a sharp difference between what you can be aware of as opposed to unaware of, and what you can become informed of. So there's a difference between lack of information and lack of awareness. And standard epistemic logic typically models your uncertainty as lack of information. So when you look at the plurality of possible worlds epistemically, that means you lack information on which one is the actual one, right? You have a plurality of epistemic possibility. Whereas when you are unaware of something, you can't even entertain the thing. So you can't imagine, in a sense, the relevant proposition. So I would suggest looking at this kind of literature. Awareness logics are cool. They're used in economics. They are used in epistemic logic, although they're less famous than standard Hintika style epistemic logic. So basically, the idea is that there are some formulas of your formal language which just cannot be supposed or imagined because you lack awareness. And there's also a dynamic logic of awareness, which models how you can become aware of something you were not aware of before. The general case is like people say, oh, you are not aware of a certain proposition when you lack a certain concept. So, and if you lack the concept, you cannot think about the propositional content. For instance, I don't know, if you don't know what the game of Go is, okay, you cannot believe that John is playing Go because you have no idea what that proposition is, okay? It may be similar in cases of incapacity to imagine certain propositional content. So I would look at some kind of combination of the framework that I presented to you with awareness logic.
Thank you.
So, are there any questions in Zoom or the audience? So, okay. I wonder, are there any connections or translations between your approach and dynamic doxastic logic in Dutch style in style of Baltok, Smets?
Yeah, cool. So you said Baltak, Smets, so you mentioned Alexander Sordia, they're good friends of mine, but then you also said dynamic doxastic logic. So it's two different things. What Alexander and Sonia do, like Van Bentham style, is dynamic epistemic logic. Dynamic doxastic logic is a thing developed by Segerberg, Hannes Leitgeb, and other people, and they try to provide a recapture of KGM belief revision, the kind of Grane stuff that I presented, in dynamic doxastic logic. So there's a couple of papers where they say basically, AGM belief revision can be recaptured in one way in dynamic doxastic logic. KGM, which is different, can be recaptured in a different way. I don't think Alexander and Sonia and the Van Bentham tradition of dynamic epistemic logic ever tried to do KGM recapture. So if you look at their classical Dell work, they prove that in dynamic epistemic logic you can give a model recapture of AGM, of axiomatic AGM belief revision. But I'm not aware, and I've read a lot of their works and I talk to them very often. I'm not aware of them trying to provide a recapture of KGM, axiomatic theory of belief update. That may be an interesting project. Yeah, I don't think they've done it, but they should do it because Yeah, KGM is less famous than AGM, but it just models the different ways of updating probability. So you don't revise your beliefs when you have new information on the actual world or the unchanged actual world. You update your beliefs in a model setting or in a counterfactual setting, or when you believe that the world has changed in the relevant sense. And that I don't think that has been tried in DEL, in dynamic epistemic logic yet. Yeah. So there's room for a paper or two there.
Okay. Am I right? The main difference is that they're based on classical propositional logic, but for your approach, counterfactuals are important. That's why you change the basic level of propositions.
It's kind of right. So there are lots of problems in the interaction between AGM and the indicative conditional, because there's a triviality result by Gardenforth that shows that so basically the Ramsey test for the indicative conditional is incompatible with AGM, but such incompatibility does not hold for counterfactuals and KGM. So in this sense, what you said is true. So AGM, belief revision, DEL recapture, and indicative conditional are difficult to put together, all of them. Whereas in theory, it's easier to put together KGM belief revision, the counterfactual setting that I proposed to you, and maybe a hypothetical recapture of DEL, a hypothetical recapture of KGM in DEL. Anyway, that's all right. That what you said is right in the sense that in the kind of counterfactual approach that will be presented to you, you can have a counterfactual conditional in the language. It obeys the Ramsey test. That's what I've shown. You cannot have the same in the indicative case in DEL. Because especially when you work with nested belief operators, things get complicated. So the success postulate of AGM can fail. The interactions with the indicative condition are complicated. There are lots of complications which are not there in the counterfactual case.
Okay, thank you. Another possible extension is a first order predicate extension, because the topics like imagination are very rich from the philosophical point of view. It seems that propositional logic is too weak to grab this phenomenon. Are there any extension to predicate logic?
So there are first order counterfactual logics, so counterfactuals plus first order language. I'm not aware of theories of belief update in the Grane setting, so recapturing KGM for a first order modal language. Maybe there's something out there, but not that I know. All the work is propositional. It may be interesting to try to do that, especially because imagination, since we're talking about that, is not only propositional, but it's also objectual. So it's not only that you can imagine that John is happy, you can imagine John, okay, or you can imagine John as happy, and you may want to have a first order language for that, right? And so that's what makes the project interesting. Also, when you want to investigate imagination, imagination and its logic, yeah. So also there's some work to be done.
Yeah, especially there is awareness first order logic. Maybe
there is awareness first order logic. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Есть вопрос, нет? Yeah. У вас. Anna, again, okay, please.
I have a short question. How can we make closer acquaintance with the material of your talk? Is there any publications or? Published?
Yeah. I have a couple of co-authored papers under review, but I have one paper that's coming out in Ergo, if you want that stuff. There's more than that, because it's an anti-Williamson paper, so you will not care about the anti-Williamson parts. That's because Williamson has written this book, Suppose and Tell, on conditionals, where he tries to argue that our procedures to assess counterfactual conditionals are inconsistent. I argue that they are not, because you got all these models and the Ramsey test works and so on. So there are bits that will not matter for you because I speak against Williamson, but I basically recapture the results that I presented in this slide. So I'll send you the paper. I'll send you the slide. The slides I already emailed to you last night, but I'll send you the paper as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the interesting talk and fruitful discussion. Hope
Thanks
to
a
see
lot
you.
for inviting me, and thanks a lot for the very, very competent questions. They were very useful, folks. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.